So Queen in Black is a pretty solid start so far, but I'm kind of curious to see where the story goes because it is a 5-issue miniseries, and it's basically building up to the fight between Knull the symbiote god, who's now the King of Light, and Hela, who has all of Knull's old powers, and we'll talk about what that means here in a second so you guys aren't left hanging. But basically, Knull arrives here on the scene mulling over what his next step is going to be, which is to say he's no longer king of the symbiotes. He doesn't really control any of the living abyss anymore. And again, that kind of feeds into his solo series. Now, we have covered the miniseries if you guys are interested in that, but the long and short of what happened was that where Knull was previously believed to have been destroyed, it turned out Hela had captured him. Now, there is going to be a one-shot comic in Queen in Black that is going to explain how that happened. But what ends up going on is Knull basically launches an escape, and he's in a fairly weakened state considering Hela's been siphoning off his power for herself. And so he ends up gaining the ability to essentially tap into quote-unquote light. And we'll get more of an explanation of what that means here in a minute. But in effect, he's stronger than he's ever been. And so that's why in this moment, right, he says, the burning in me, the delicious agony of it, it spurs me on to commit the ultimate act of degradation upon foul existence, to spit in proud eternity's face and murder all that is with my own light. For light or dark, I am still God of the void, and a God needs angels, symbiotes, but without the flaws of my previous pets, without the spirit to rebel against me, without potential for mind or morality, without the need to bond with lessers. And so that's what he does. He literally ends up creating a whole new set of beings, which he calls his seraphim. Now, it is important to understand, this is more ceremonial than anything else, because within Marvel Comics, Seraphim and Cherubim do exist. They're actually mutants in Marvel. Nightcrawler is descended from them, alongside Azazel, who in Marvel Comics was Nightcrawler's dad, although apparently that's changed over the years. But the fact is, this is just kind of this idea of an angelic response, right? It's kind of how Knull sees himself. Now, all of this is being watched by Hela and Tyr. And Hela, of course, having all of Knull's previous powers, seemingly it makes them equal. Now, we don't definitively know if that's the case. The two of them have not gone head to head yet. Everything that we've seen up to this point involving Hela and Knull have basically been Marvel just kind of establishing what their new normal is, with this inevitable conflict being the end result. What's also interesting about this is that what Hela's doing is she's launching an attack on Earth directly. Now, we don't quite fully understand what her motivation is, but for all intents and purposes, it's a sneak attack, because one of the things to remember is no one on Earth remembers about the Asgardian mythos. And we'll talk about that here in a second, because that's one of the plot threads that plays into this. But this is where I say that Marvel does not establish when this story takes place, because at that point, you switch over to Avengers Mansion, and it's basically Tony Stark being caught up on everything that's been going on with the symbiotes, right? Learning that Mary Jane Watson is Venom, which is kind of a cool thing because during Dan Slott's all-new Spider-Man, basically Tony Stark wasn't officially banging MJ, but we all kind of know he was. Or at the very least, they touched naughty bits at some point. I mean, I have a hard time believing that they never banged. Marvel says they didn't, but I have a hard time believing that never happened, right? But she was essentially his assistant. But the fact is, they do have history together here. And one of the things she talks about is that the world's not supposed to know that Mary Jane is Venom, right? But again, Tony Stark learning about all of this, he's also learning about Captain Spider, which is basically Dylan Brock. Flash Thompson is still operating as Anti-Venom, although he's Agent Anti-Venom at this point. And then Spider-Man is, of course, Spider-Man. But I do want to talk about Dylan for a second. I'm not going to run over the whole history just because of the fact that Dylan's history alone could make up an entire video. The only thing you really need to understand in the here and now is that Dylan is the son of Eddie Brock, right? Venom, as we traditionally know him. Although again, the Venom symbiote is bonded to Mary Jane Watson. Dylan historically had the ability to control symbiotes. That's kind of become a background part of his character. In more recent years, the brunt of his storytelling has been focused on abandonment issues with his father, Eddie, and a lot of the animosity that was held at that point in time. It's not to say Marvel's wasted him. They've simply just chosen to focus more on the nature of Dylan and his relationship with his father as opposed to his powers. I have no doubt that over the course of this, his powers will play a more central role. But for Spider-Man, what's what's also interesting here is that Spider-Man's had his own adventures going out into space and facing off against Hellgate and so on. So while he has mentioned to Tony Stark that he's keeping an eye on what's going on with the symbiotes, truth to tell, he hasn't, because he just had too much stuff going on. But the other point in bringing in the idea of when this takes place in relation to Armageddon, the other major event that Marvel has going on right now, we don't really get an explanation. And it's kind of wonky, because what ends up happening is that all the Avengers, which includes Storm, because she's effectively still an Avenger at this point, as well as the Fantastic Four, are called together for a meeting. Captain America Steve Rogers is here. Now, during the events of Armageddon, he's actually in Hell, alongside Dr. Doom, basically starting a revolution against Mephisto. Quite literally, Captain America is leading a revolt in Hell. It's pretty dope, to be honest with you guys. But you also don't see David Colton here. David Colton is a major figure in the events of Armageddon and has actually kind of been brought into the Marvel scene because of Armageddon, or at least the events leading up to it. And because of the fact that Marvel's Armageddon event is supposed to see the deaths of a bunch of different characters and a reformation of the Avengers into a combination of the historical Mighty Avengers and New Avengers teams, this looks like it takes place before Armageddon. But the fact is, when this meeting is called together, the group is joined by a guy named Captain Alliance. Now, Captain Alliance is actually Regars, and he's been around for a little bit within Marvel Comics, not for a super lengthy amount of time. His story kind of leads into the events of Queen in Black, but his involvement in the lead up really didn't do anything more than establish the fact that what's going on out there in the universe, especially after the events of Imperial, where you no longer have a unified universe, meaning all the different empires are working together and they share a single council and so on and so forth. It's all very much divided and scattered. Information gets lost in all of that. And so in that chaos, what's been going on here is a kind of cult of Knull has started to rise to prominence. So for those of you guys who are familiar with the history of Marvel Comics, it's very similar to the Universal Church of Truth, which is to say multiple people, whether by force or by choice, are joining this effective cult religion, right, by all standards of measurement. And that's what Captain Alliance talks about here when he says Knull is back. And so, of course, Spider-Man asks, well, I have two, and they're important. Question one, is it me or does this guy just look like Captain America, right? And number two, are the Skrulls copying our stuff again? Like, is Secret Invasion happening? And that's where Captain Alliance or Regars is just kind of like, I'm not really sure what you're talking about. And he says, I'm a super soldier from a previous era wearing a flag that represents a shared dream I remain loyal to despite massive societal changes. So yeah, basically Captain America. But it is kind of a little funny moment there. The point is, he says, there's a cult spreading through the galaxy, a religious faction that the big players have not noticed, right under everyone's nose. I recently dealt with some of them, and it makes sense. In a galaxy in constant upheaval, it's easy to feel alone, to look anywhere you can for a community that lasts. Symbiotes provide a communion with something greater, and Knull feeds their sense of nihilism. Now, I also want to point out here, this story is written by Al Ewing. Al Ewing is one of these writers where he will use universe and galaxy interchangeably in the same way that he'll use multiverse and omniverse interchangeably. So when he talks about this idea of this is happening in the galaxy, just assume he's talking about the universe. And so that's where Captain Alliance continues on and makes a good point here, right? He says, why struggle with the responsibilities of freedom when you can surrender all that to a charismatic leader, even when that leader wants to march you all to oblivion? And so that's where Steve is like, yeah, I guess Earth isn't really the only place where people struggle with that. But the fact is, right, this idea of Knull returning puts the superheroes in this question of, okay, well, what does it mean that he's coming back? Because keep in mind, at the end of the King in Black event, Knull was defeated and Eddie Brock became the new King in Black. Hence a lot of the struggles that he had with the Sun, that Eddie Brock had a responsibility to the universe itself. And so that separated him from Dylan. That's where the abandonment issues come into play, that Eddie was kind of off in space doing King in Black stuff and then eventually went off and did his own thing. And Dylan was in a lot of ways just kind of left to figure things out on Earth by himself. And so as far as the superheroes are concerned, the last time they saw Knull, he showed up on Earth with the Celestials in tow, having conquered them and almost destroyed everything in existence. And so that's why Wanda shows up here and says, I am the current sorcerer supreme of this reality. reality, and the King in Black is one of the mechanisms of reality. Knull had a role in the grand clockwork of existence, and even if he rejected it, the role remains. Through the eye of Agamotto, I can locate the throne in black, the onyx throne, and see who sits there now. All I need is a connection. And so that's where she grabs Venom. Now, Mary Jane does say, look, as the Venom symbiote, I'm not connected to Knull anymore. We're separated from the symbiote hive mind. But the response of Wanda is, yes, but you were connected to it at one point. That thin bit of history creates a bridge. And in that, I can use my abilities to see who sits on the throne. The problem is that when Wanda does that, it invokes HELA, and HELA says, who dares look upon me uninvited? I bar your witch's sight. I block your gaze. Be gone. And literally casts Wanda out. Now, that's the crazy thing, is because at that point, Beta Ray Bill is shocked, right? He's like, HELA. HELA is the one who sits on the throne. Now, one of the funny things about this is that at that point, Beta Ray Bill goes on an explanation because Wanda says the spell worked. That was the King in Black or the Queen in Black on the symbiote throne. Whoever we saw, they have all the power of the Clintar and more. The counterspell that blocked the eye was magic of a kind I've never faced. Now, that's interesting because that is when Beta Ray Bill goes on his speech. He says, her name is HELA. She is goddess of death, ruler of hell, wife to the queen of fates, and in times past, counted god of war as her loyal soldier. Many times has she threatened the golden realm of Asgard. Many times has Asgard fought her back. Now she is here in the mortal realm, and I fear you are not ready. Now, when I was originally reading this, I was like, what is Marvel talking about? Right? The superheroes have faced off against HELA how many times at this point? She's not some new entity, but that's because I forgot what Marvel did with Immortal Thor. One of the things to remember, and this is the reason why Queen in Black is cool, but it relies way too much on people understanding everything that's happening in Marvel Comics. When Marvel ended Immortal Thor and went into the Mortal Thor comic, which is written by Al Ewing, who's also writing this, Immortal Thor ended with basically all knowledge of the Asgardian mythos wiped away from the minds of everybody on Earth. And so that's why Beta Ray Bill is making this exposition. Not even Hercules remembers. And Hercules even says this, is this that Thor business again? I tell you, friend Bill, there was no such hero. If the Norse gods had walked the earth, the Greek gods would know of it. Now, as far as Thor himself, he's back to being a mortal guy, he's Sigurd, but doesn't really know his own history. And in fact, Loki's operating on Earth, along with Donald Blake, right? Thor's alter ego, who has his own body and is his own guy, doing villainous stuff. But a lot of the Asgardian mythos stuff in relation to Thor is just over there, and like this part of New York, doing its own thing. And no one's really aware of it, because Thor's a construction worker at this point and doesn't even know his own past. And so that's why no one here knows about HELA, the significance she has or the threat she poses, because she quite literally is the Asgardian Queen of Death. When she shows up, all hell will break loose. She is immensely powerful. And so that's why Beta Ray Bill calls the Avengers together, kind of rallies everybody's morale. And at that point, you switch back over to Knull. And Knull says, very nice. It seems I grow more adept at scoping the light with each passing hour. And he says, the lure of creation is a subtle trap. Only nothing is truly worth anything. I should destroy what I've made. I really should. And perhaps later. But the problem is that where he's musing to himself, he's met by Richard Rider, because Richard Rider, as Nova Centurion, understands the threat of Knull. And in channeling the power of the world mind, one of the things that I want to remind you guys of is that as it stands right now in Marvel Comics, Richard Rider is kind of like his own act. And in fact, his own solo series is kind of hilarious. He would basically show up to people and rescue them and then ask for money in helping them, but almost nobody would actually ask for his help. And if we're being honest with ourselves, he's basically the Marvel Comics cosmic equivalent of when you're stopped at a red light and a dude just like runs up on you, washes your windshield, and then just tells you they want to be paid for it. So effectively, Richard Rider is an intergalactic panhandler. I hate to put it that way, and it's going to piss off Richard Rider fans, but honestly, it's what makes his story amazing in Marvel Comics right now. It's hilarious. He's dope. But the fact is, he shows up here and the world mind channels 250% of the power he normally has. And keep in mind, Richard Rider at just normal power levels is enough to hold his own against some pretty formidable enemies out there. We saw that in the Stephanie Phillips Phoenix miniseries. And so the world mind channeling 250% of his normal energy, you would think would be enough to destroy Knull. At least that's what Richard Rider thinks. And it's not, right? Knull withstands the full might of this blast and then disintegrates him on the spot. So Richard Rider, this poor bastard, getting disintegrated at the very beginning of the story. This disrespect needs to be studied, man. Richard Rider fans are gonna be pissed. These guys are gonna be so mad. But the point is, Hela and Tyr are watching all of this unfold. And so in that moment, it's really more than just kind of keeping an eye on Knull. Their main focus is launching an attack on Earth. And that's exactly what they do. Egypt, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, New York City, they all get attacked by the symbiotes. Just one giant attack launching at the same time. And by hitting multiple places at once and doing it with overwhelming force, it stretches the superheroes too thin, which is something that Tony Stark will start to realize pretty quickly. Now, you do have Spider-Man and his guys who show up here, right? Rescuing what looks to be Aunt May. We're not explicitly told it's her, but I mean, like, it's an old lady with gray hair who almost gets shot in the face. What is it supposed to be? Just like some chick named Susan? So yeah, it's most likely Aunt May, right? Or it's Susan, right? This poor woman. Luckily, she's saved by Spider-Man and all his guys. But there's also a reason for why it is that these forces are showing up here in the first place. And honestly, it goes into the history of Earth within Marvel Comics. So the history of Earth, especially when you're talking about the Kree-Skrull War, Earth is in a very strategic location. It's the reason why the Kree ended up looking at what the Celestials did when they effectively created mutants and deviants and Eternals on Earth, and then essentially copied that same format and put Inhumans on Earth. Because Earth being strategically located, whichever race gained a foothold on Earth would actually be able to turn the tide in their favor. It's why there's been so many visits here, right? It's why the Skrulls brought the Kree and the Kotati to the blue area of the moon during the Earth's early days, and then that led, of course, to the initial start of the war between the Kree and the Skrulls. But the point is that Earth is a significant place. Honestly, the biggest reason why Earth matters is because the most powerful beings in the Marvel Universe are collected here. Right? It's one of like the banes of existence when it comes to pretty much any other empire in the Marvel Universe, right? In fact, there's a story called Hulk the End where all the superheroes are destroyed. A recorder shows up and it's just kind of like, yeah, the other empires of the universe are actually happy you guys are gone because you guys have just been a pain in the ass pretty much the entire time. It's kind of depressing, to be honest with you. But that's one of the big reasons why Hela's here. Destroy the superheroes on Earth, and it makes it almost impossible for the universe to be able to launch a meaningful offense against Hela. Because destroying Earth means destroying reality warpers, it means destroying mutants, it means destroying the Avengers, the Fantastic Four, some of the best minds and most powerful people in Marvel. But Scarlet Witch shows up here and confronts a handful of Hela's agents while they're at the pyramids. Because what the superheroes figure out is that there's also a device, potentially a weapon, that's going to be constructed here on Earth by Hela's forces. And the whole goal is to stop that from happening. Now, we don't know explicitly what this device is, but it is something of significance. But there's also this really dope moment here with Wanda when she's talking to Hela's forces, because the force field kind of experiences this momentary glitch and then shuts down. And they're kind of like, how in the world does this happen? The probability of this actually happening is astronomical. But of course, among Wanda's various abilities, and arguably her original ability, was probability manipulation. Although again, that's kind of changed over the years with retcons and chaos energy and so on and so forth. But the point is, she says, I am Wanda Maximoff of Earth, Sorcerer Supreme of this reality, but I don't need that kind of power to deal with you. A little teleportation and a subtle boost of my innate power over the laws of chance is all it takes to end this. And that's where they say, you've ended nothing, right? Because these guys show up with all manner of weapons. And they say, even if the protective shield is down, Earther weapons cannot damage the Transformer. This section of your world will be remade along with all sentience in range in 5 temporal units and counting. So essentially 5 minutes. So do your worst, Primitive. We do not need to lift a finger. And that's where Wanda's like, oh, I won't lay a finger on you, Commander, but I didn't open the shield for the local army. I opened it for an old friend, because she asked, do you know what kinetic bombardment is? An idea from the Cold War, tungsten rods dropped from orbit, reaching terminal velocity and hitting like tactical nuclear weapons. Currently, the Vision is descending from the upper atmosphere. He's increasing his density as he goes to several times harder than tungsten. He's using boot jets that push himself faster than terminal velocity, and he's aimed right at your precious Transformer in 3, 2, 1, and just detonates like an explosion and obliterates it. And I gotta be honest with you guys, man, treating Vision like a battering ram is dope. This is amazing. Like, this is one of the coolest moments in the story. I love when Marvel uses Vision like this. Certainly not the first time, but it's always cool when it happens. And so that's where Tony Stark asks Wanda, did you just destroy the Great Pyramid of Giza, Wanda? And she's like, no. The Regellians did that, right? There's some of the soldiers that are working alongside Hela and are bonded with symbiote matter. She's like, but I can use magic to restore everything once it's all said and done. But that's where she says, I'd guess that we have bigger problems right now. And Tony Stark says, yes, like no disrespect, but you and Viz drew the easy straw. Even with the X-Men and the Fantastic Four backing us up, we're stretched thin, covering this global assault, and we cannot play defense forever. And that's where Wanda says, we can join the others. And Tony Stark chimes in and says, and then Hela drops another terraformer somewhere that you're not, and we lose a country. I need you watching the skies. And so that's where he's just kind of like, come back, Knull, right? All is forgiven. Because sometimes the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. And keep in mind, Hela is a master tactician, and that's what they're facing off against here, right? They're facing off against a goddess of death who's a master at military strategy. But that's the crazy thing, is because Reed Richards overhears it and is like, so we need to have a conversation, because I heard what you said about Knull, and honestly, I don't think you fully understand what's going on here. Because at that point, we end up finding out Richard Rider didn't die. He actually survived and teleported away at the last minute before he was incinerated. But that's where he fills them in and is like, look, Knull, whatever he is now, is not the King in Black, right? He is the King of Light, and he's able to manipulate the entirety of the electromagnetic spectrum. Is how he overcame Richard Rider in the first place. All forms of energy are part of the electromagnetic spectrum, meaning if it is a form of energy, Knull controls it. So that basically nullifies anybody with energy abilities right off the bat. So then that severely limits what they're capable of, right? At that point, it almost kind of reduces the battle down to nothing more than brute strength. But the question becomes, how do you overcome somebody like Knull using brute strength? Because lest we forget, the Incredible Hulk right now is possessed by a demon and building an army across the world. Yeah, and the state of Marvel right now, Earth is in a pretty bad spot. There's a lot of really crappy things happening on Earth at the same time. And so that's where Tony's kind of filled in on everything that's happening. They're effectively facing off against two threats at the same time. There's Knull, who's amassing his army with the intention of wiping out everything in existence. And then there's Hela. So even if they manage to overcome Hela, they're gonna have to find a way to overcome Knull. So yeah, it's a bad spot. And that's a crazy thing here, is because in the midst of all of this, there's a kind of conversation with Spider-Man, right? About what they can actually do, what chances they really have, right? And that's where Captain Alliance says they're dropping the all-purpose power tool and troops to activate it. Take out the smaller pods and be ready to defuse the big one. right? And so that's where Spider-Man is just like, sure, right? Walk me through that last part. And he's like, I'm just saying, I fight crooks with animal themes, and sometimes I lift heavy objects. I am not the super soldier type, which honestly, I don't know how I feel about that statement, because Spider-Man's pretty capable. And I don't know how I feel about Al Ewing downplaying Spider-Man's confidence, intelligence, or even his abilities. It feels like it's kind of being done just for the sake of the story, because what happens is in response to Peter making that statement, somebody just says, agreed. Luckily, I am, and it's Cable. Cable shows up here on the scene. And this is one of those weird moments, man, because in Marvel Comics, regardless of what you've seen in X-Men 97, Cable is a retcon machine. The only time Cable shows up in a story is when someone's gonna do something and Cable's like, don't do that shit, you're gonna ruin the future. And that's it. That's the only time he ever shows up, right? So I'm curious to see what they end up doing with this, because what ends up happening is he shows up here, destroys a guy, and Peter's like, look, man, I mean, there was a person in there. All we had to do was figure out a way to get the symbiote off of him. And even Agent Anti-Venom is like, look, Pete, we love the fact that you value the sanctity of life, but this is not one of those times when we can stop and try to figure out a way to cure these guys of their symbiote infection, if you want to call it that. The reality is we got to destroy these guys. Right? But that's where Cable reveals that he showed up here to basically conscript Anti-Venom. And that's when he says, here's the short version. This is bigger than we all thought, aliens included. So now either we take the fight to the enemy or we kiss all of it goodbye. So literally, apparently there's a much bigger event going on here than we were all left to believe. I told you guys, that's why Cable shows up in stories, because Marvel's going to expand it out in some capacity. No doubt, Cable was only introduced in this story because of X-Men 97. So I would go so far as to argue Marvel probably just shoehorned him in through tie-ins, but we'll see what happens, because that whole story continues on in King in Black, Defenders of Light and Dark, which is a 3-issue miniseries from what I can tell. But regardless, he ends up grabbing Flash Thompson and is like, body slide by 2, and teleports him out. But in the midst of this whole conversation, 3 pods crash land in front of Spider-Man and all. And that's when we end up finding out that now what's happening is HELA is deploying super scrolls that are also imbued with symbiotes. So super scrolls are basically scrolls that historically have the powers of other superheroes. The Super Skrull was like the first that was introduced in Marvel, and he had the powers of the Fantastic Four. But it's kind of become a thing ever since then that sometimes Skrulls show up that are imbued with abilities of a variety of superheroes. Regardless, these are heavy hitters. These are guys who can grow to astronomical sizes, and in effect, they've been imbued with the powers of Giant Man and Wasp, so they can shrink down, they can grow, that kind of thing. And that's when you end up finding out the bigger picture of what's going on with the attack. These guys are a distraction, because Spider-Man and the symbiotes realize they can't necessarily web these guys up in the traditional sense. And so these guys show up here and they end up activating the device that landed here on Earth in the first place. Once it fires up, we end up finding out that what they've done here is they've activated this device using Skrull symbiotes as raw matter. And the question's asked by Mary Jane, right? What are they doing? And that's where Captain Alliance says, think about it. What would the Kree bring into the battle? What's the ideal fusion for them? Only the ultimate mix of symbiote and Kree biotechnology. The symbiote intelligence. So what we're talking about here is essentially a field commander, because keep in mind, the supreme intelligence of the Kree Empire is historically the combination of all the Kree's brightest minds that have ever existed in the history of the Empire. Scientists, leaders, military commanders, the whole 9 yards. So to go to war against the Kree being led by the supreme intelligence is to go to war against a veritable army of military commanders, all of whom operate on an intergalactic and genius level. That's what you're getting here, a now organized and unified symbiote hive mind, all taking orders from a single being who will most likely be almost indestructible. So, is the story a solid start? Sure. My concern is this is gonna be every Marvel crossover right now, where it starts off great and then goes to shit by issue number 2. But we'll find out. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.